I want to thank you all for coming today. My name is Randy Leidy. I'm Dean of the College of Health Sciences and Professions. And Brad Cohen, who is the Vice Provost for Instructional Innovation, and I are pleased to co-sponsor the presentation today. We spend a lot of time around here really thinking about who we are as a university, who we should become as a university. And I think it's always good for institutions periodically to step back and reflect on what it is we do, who do we do it for, how do we do it, what environment do we do it in. And I'm very excited that we could bring Jeff Selingo to campus today. If you haven't had a chance to read any of Jeff's writings, his book College Unbound, or any of his editorials or his work in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I've had a chance to hear him now 3 times. We're trying to decide if that makes me officially a groupie or not, that this is number 4. I'm following him around like he's the Grateful Dead or something. But I've had a chance to hear him talk about some of the information that might inform our consideration of all of those questions. And I'm just so excited he could be here today to share some of his reflections on higher education, and where we are today in our society, maybe a little bit about where we're going, and then we'll have some time at the end for some questions, hopefully, as well. So without further ado, I'll invite Jeff Selingo to come up.
Thank you. You definitely get a frequent audience card for your 3 talks. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invite. As I was mentioning at lunch with some folks, I worked for the Chronicle in a variety of roles for 18 years, and as part of that, I was a state reporter and traveled to probably about 30 plus states in that time, including Ohio many times, but I've actually never been on your campus. So it's great to be here, and I'm really excited to have a chance to engage you about the future of higher education today. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So please, there's always usually crickets at first when you say, okay, I'm ready for questions, and then usually they fly after that. So please, I'll give a little reward for the person who has the first one. I'll give you a free book for the next book. My background is as a journalist, and having a journalism school on campus, you probably understand this. I am not an academic. I always tell academic audiences this. Several years ago, I was speaking at the University of Kentucky and giving a talk about College Unbound, my book that came out in 2013. And at the end of the presentation, a faculty member, who I later learned was a faculty member, so I'm not just disparaging a faculty member here, but she asked, she raised her hand and she said, Mr. Selingo, this is all fine and good, but she said, what were your research methods for this book? And I said, well, I'm a journalist, and in journalism, 3 anecdotes equals a trend. Now, I have more than 3 anecdotes today. But I do come from a journalism background. I have never worked full-time on a college campus. I have affiliations now with Georgia Tech and Arizona State, but as a professor of practice and a visiting scholar there, my background is in journalism. I continue to practice it, and I continue to write books, and also now write for the Washington Post. So my job is to really go out there, interview the experts, translate their research, their knowledge, and also talk to parents and students, professors, presidents, employers, which I've done over the last 5 years in writing both the last book, College Unbound, which I'll talk a lot about today, as well as the next book called There is Life After College, which comes out on April 12th. And so I'll be teasing a little bit about what's in that book. But my hope today is to really challenge you to kind of rethink where we are in terms of higher education in the U.S. My focus will be largely on the U.S. Today, but to really challenge you to rethink where we're going as both a country and as a higher education system, both in the state of Ohio, but also writ large in terms of national aspect of higher education. I think it's really critical that we begin to rethink what is happening now with higher education. I think a lot of changes are happening at individual institutions, as many of us talked at lunch today. And I think it's critical that the institutions that are going to survive and thrive are those that are going to rethink their model for the 80% of Americans that I'll talk about in a minute that I believe that higher education is not well serving. So again, I'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so please think of many or challenges. You may even have some challenges to me, and I hope you do. So I got my start in journalism, in higher education journalism at U.S. News and World Report. I usually like to walk during talks, but we're live streaming today, so I have to kind of stay in a little confined space. I got my start at U.S. News and World Report back in the early 1990s as an intern. And a couple of years ago when I was cleaning out my office at the Chronicle, I came across these rankings from 1989. So these are the U.S. News and World Report rankings from 1989. Now, what will amaze you is that this is 1989 was the first year U.S. News and World Report did annual rankings. So before that, they only did rankings every other year. And this is all they did. They ranked the top 25 colleges and universities in the country. They ran this one little list with an article, and that was it. Those were the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Now, you know what the rankings look like today. They're an entire business. They have a book. They rank essentially every college. They have regional colleges, best buys, best publics, best universities, best liberal arts colleges. But this is all they did back in 1989. Now, you'll notice a couple of things about this list if you look closely at it. One is, when I found this in my office at the Chronicle, was the right-hand column, which everybody tended to focus on, talking about how great of a deal Stanford University was at $12,000 a year back in 1989. But there were two other things that I noticed. One is the number of public universities on this list back in 1989. And if you compare that to the list today, in the top 25, there are only 3 public universities on that list. So all the changes in the top 25 national universities in U.S. News and World Report over the last couple of decades have all been among rising private universities and falling public universities. And I'll tell you a reason why in a second. And then the middle column is really what gets me, and that's what they called back in 1989 the rating. When U.S. News and World Report started the rankings back in the early 1980s, it was literally a beauty contest. Now, some will still argue it is a beauty contest, but it really was just a beauty contest in the early 1980s. It was a way to sell magazines, and they would send out a survey to college presidents at that time, just college presidents. Now they've added guidance counselors and admissions officers to it, but just college presidents, and they basically say, tell us what you think of these other universities. And that would compose the rating. I arrived at U.S. News and World Report in 1994, and by then they started to add what they called a scientific measure to the rankings. Now, of course, they had a bunch of 22-year-olds working on the rankings, so I'm not quite sure how scientific it was. My job was to call up schools who had not reported their data because they now started to add this data element to the rankings. And it's what you all know, right? It's essentially the input measures of the ratings that now define U.S. News and World Report. So, the strength of the incoming class in terms of class rank and GPA and SAT scores, how much money institutions spend on faculty in terms of faculty salaries and student to faculty ratio, how much money they were bringing in terms of alumni donations. So there were all these factors that were added to the U.S. News and World Report rankings since these rankings in 1989, and they were all input measures. And I think this is important because I'm going to be talking about today how I think the rankings are going to change in higher education and focus much more on outputs. But what this did over the last 2 decades in higher education was touch off this prestige race because everybody wanted to change those inputs in order to rise up in the rankings. And it wasn't just the U.S. News and World Report rankings, because what that did was spawn all these other rankings by other magazines, other entities, both domestically and internationally. And what's interesting to me in the last couple of years as I've been traveling around, not just to college campuses for the book, but also to talk about the book, is that I would normally be invited to a campus and somebody would give me the tour of the campus and they would show me what they thought were the most innovative things they were doing on those campuses. And we would go off to some corner of campus and they would invite me into a department or a school and they would say, this is what we're doing, and this is what we're doing that's most innovative. And I would always wonder, well, if it's working so well, why are you just doing it in this school or this department or in this area of campus? So I actually think higher education gets a bum rap by saying it's not innovative and it's change averse. There's actually a lot of great changes happening on campus, but the problem is they're small and they tend to be shuttered to one side of campus. And I was always wondering why this was happening. And so eventually later on in the day when I would visit some of these campuses, I would get to talk to the president or somebody on the president's cabinet or maybe a trustee. And the answer that always came back to me was pretty similar. And it was this: well, we don't want to look very different than the institutions we're competing against, where we are now, or many times, and if they're really being honest about it, they would say, we don't want to look different than the institutions we're trying to become. And so there was this prestige race that I think has really hurt higher education over the last 20 years, and that, in my opinion, is over, because most institutions can't afford to run this race. And I don't think that in many cases it's been serving students very well over the last 2 decades. At the same time, the higher education market in the US has changed drastically in the last 20 plus years. So this is work by Carolyn Hawksby, who's an economist at Stanford University, and she looked at the selectivity of institutions over the last 50 years. And one thing she noticed is that the market for higher education has become much more national and international over the last 50 years. And indeed, for all the talk about how difficult it is to get into college, talk about those trend stories that are based on anecdotes, usually in the New York Times, it is actually, in many cases, in some places, much easier to get into college today than it was 50 years ago, as this market for higher education has changed drastically thanks to transportation and technology. And when we see statistics like this, we then hear predictions like this from Clay Christensen, writing in the New York Times a couple of years ago, predicting that a bottom tier of every college and university will go out of business in the next 10 or 15 years. Now, I don't agree with Clay on a lot of things. I think it's very hard to put a college out of business. If you had followed the news at all, in higher education last year, you would know that Sweetbriar College, a small little women's liberal arts college in Southern Virginia, tried to go out of business, which caused a bunch of uproar there, including from its alumni and politicians in Virginia, and it has thus survived. So if we can't even put a 700 college student college out of business, it's going to be much harder to put the bottom 25% of every tier of institutions out in the next 10 or 15 years. When I talk to development officers, I always tell them if they want to raise millions of dollars, in some cases maybe billions of dollars, but in millions of dollars in the next couple of years, just tell your alumni that you're going to go out of business, and suddenly you'll see the spigots opened up like they did at Sweetbriar College. But that doesn't mean, just because I don't think that all these colleges like Clay Christensen thinks are going to go out of business, that doesn't mean that higher education is not going to undergo substantial changes in the next decade plus. And it's largely because we have seen changes in other businesses and other sectors of the economy over the last 10 or 15 years. So just think about what it was like to be in Blockbuster when Netflix came along, or Borders when Amazon came along, or Tower Records when iTunes came along, and then to think about Apple a couple of years ago had to go out and spend $3 billion buying Beats Music because people were no longer downloading music. In just a decade, we've moved from buying CDs at Tower Records to downloading music on iTunes to now streaming music. And Apple was caught somewhat flat-footed, and they had to go out and buy Beats Music as a result. I see this in my own business in higher education. You know, a couple of, about 10, 15 years ago in journalism, I would be at gatherings very similar to this, and I'd be sitting in rooms very similar to this, and somebody would be at the front of the room talking about how change was about to come to publishing, right? And this is a couple of years after the internet, and people would say, you know, nobody will want to get a newspaper on their front door anymore. And, you know, editors and publishers in the room would be shaking their heads saying it's never going to happen. Somebody will one day want to read a newspaper on a desktop computer, we were told, but we didn't want to believe it, right? We believed we were a public trust, right? That people always wanted us, they will always want us, no matter what happens. In many ways, I think that journalists and academics are cut from a lot of the same cloth. We like to Journalists like to write about change. We don't like to be changed, and I think that in some ways, at least my work in academia over the last couple of years, I think that we like to teach about change, but we don't necessarily like to be changed ourselves, which is probably human nature for all of us. But I do think that there is going to be substantial changes, not as much as in, there's a lot of good comparisons, I think, to these other industries, but they're also not heavily regulated and heavily subsidized like higher education. But I think that the lessons from these other industries can really help higher education, because I think many of these industries didn't see change coming, and it happened essentially overnight. And again, I know that from my own industry in journalism. And why is that? So why is change going to come in higher education? I think it's going to be largely driven by students in the next 10 or 15 years. And if we think about the student market in higher ed, this is how we've always defined it, right? We either serve a traditional audience, 18 to 22-year-olds, or we serve a non-traditional audience, which is essentially everybody else. This is how we've defined higher ed. But what this doesn't take into account are the motivations and mindsets about why students come to college, about why they're there to get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. So a couple of years ago, I worked with the Parthenon group out of Boston, and we wanted to find out what are the real segments of students in higher ed, right? Traditional and non-traditional doesn't really cut it anymore, right? Because if you know anything about the market in higher ed, you know that really today's traditional students are non-traditional students. There's a lot more non-traditional students than there are traditional students in higher ed. And so we went out and we surveyed 3,000 students who were either in the middle of their bachelor's program or had just completed their bachelor's program. And we collected demographic information, so they were students of all ages and backgrounds, and they were from across the country. But what we wanted to find out is what motivated them to go to college. What did they want to get out of the experience? And how did they want to experience their undergraduate education? And from that survey and from follow-up interviews that we did with some of those survey respondents, we divided higher education into 6 segments of students. Not just the traditional and non-traditional, but 6 segments of students that we believe better represent what higher education is today. Now, these 6 segments might exist at your institution. Only 2 or 3 of them might exist here. And in some institutions, I think there are actually maybe even more than 6 segments of students. But I want to walk through briefly these 6 segments, because some of them fit neatly into that bucket of traditional students. So there are the young academics. These are students who, when I was editor of the Chronicle and I would have presidents come through my office frequently, these are the students more presidents, especially presidents, want, right? They are incredibly serious students in high school. They're high GPAs, high SAT scores. They tend to come from middle and upper middle income and upper income families, so they need less financial aid. They tend to complete and move on to graduate school after college. And from the presidents I would speak to when they would come through my office, they tend to help your U.S. News and World Report rankings. Then there were the coming of age students. These are students who see college as that coming of age experience, that experience that helps them move from adolescence to adulthood and helps transition them into life after college. And then there were these group of students that we labeled career starters. And these students are students who see college as a means to an end, which we don't necessarily think that means is always the good thing. The means being that they want to get through as quickly as possible because they want to start a career. And they see college as acquiring that piece of paper that they need to get that career afterwards. What was fascinating to us as we started to dig deeper into the data and also do the follow-up interviews is that particularly, for example, those career starters, at the age of 18, actually had more in common with some of those non-traditional students, those students we tend to call non-traditional students, who were 10, 15 years older, right? So the career accelerators, these were students who came back to school because they needed to get more education, because they either didn't have a degree or they wanted a second degree. And the biggest growth in higher education enrollment at the undergraduate level now are among those students who already have one credential and they're getting another credential. So these were students who would come back and wanted to accelerate in their career and get another credential. And then there were the industry switchers. These were students who came back to get additional education because largely they were former colleagues of mine in journalism and they suddenly needed a new career, and so they needed to come back and get another degree. And then there were the group that we labeled the adult wanderers. Those were students who told us they didn't quite know what they were going back to college for or why they were there, but they know they needed to get a degree as a signal to the job market that they were prepared for some sort of job. So it was the idea that a degree is a signal to the job market and I need to get that signal. I'm not quite sure exactly what I need, what type of degree I need, but I need some sort of credential. And then we estimated the size of these different groups. And the young academics, those students that every president told me that they wanted more of, made up the largest proportion of students in this study that we did, but they still only made up a quarter of students, right? And what amazed me as I was thinking about it, there are hundreds and even thousands of institutions around this country who are going after that one quadrant of students. When there is a large group of students that are being largely underserved, although I think much better served today than they were 10 or 15 years ago, but largely underserved, or served by, in my opinion, not by very good institutions, largely by the for-profits or institutions that don't do a very good job serving these other groups of students. And the other thing was that we have these various groups of students who have different needs, different motivations, different mindsets, but we're largely trying to push them through a one-size-fits-all system. So while we've created that system for those young academics, or maybe even those coming-of-age students, we try to put all these other students through that same system. And to me, as we think about the future of higher education, we need to think about the motivations and mindsets of all of these students. How can we create different pathways for them? So what's interesting to me is that we keep talking about Clay Christensen and in higher education. We talk about his theory of disruptive innovation. To me, the theory we should be talking about is his jobs to be done theory, right? This idea is, what do these different segments of students need? Not that everything they demand we should give them, but what do they need that we could provide as an institution? And how can we develop different pathways for these students? Because the fact of the matter is, there's just not enough of those young academics to go around to fill all the seats that are now available at colleges and universities around the country. Indeed, we tend to talk a lot about student debt in this country. We rarely talk about this number, right? This is the amount of debt now held by colleges and universities across the country, according to Moody's, and this has almost doubled since 2001, right? Most institutions were spending more money on their campuses, largely in some ways to compete for that prestige race that I talked about earlier. Now, there's nothing wrong with debt. We all have it in our lives, right? To pay for cars, to pay for houses, to pay for other consumer products. But we take on debt. When we take on debt, we tend to think, well, we're going to have a job to pay off that debt, or we're going to get a raise to pay off this debt. The problem right now in higher ed is that 3/4 of American colleges, 75% of American colleges, have either flat or declining net tuition revenue, right? So they don't have, that's the money they have left over after they give out financial aid to invest in new programs, new ideas. And 75% of them have either flat or declining net tuition revenue. I was talking to a CFO recently who told me that their net tuition revenue is the same today as it was in 2008. Even though they've been increasing their price by 4%, approximately 4% every year. And I asked him, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, we eventually think it's going to turn around, right? Eventually. I said, well, it's, now 2015, this was 2015 when I had this conversation with them, and it still hasn't turned around, but, they have the confidence this is going to turn around. And my challenge to you today is, as depressing as these statistics may be, and my goal here is not to depress you, to me, it's to challenge you, right? To think differently about the pathways that we can offer for the future. Because even if you were able to figure out that net tuition number, this is another issue that really worries me, and that's the macroeconomic issue of income in the US, right? So back in 2001, it took the median family in this country, those who were making the median earnings, less than 25% of those earnings to pay for the median sticker price at a four-year college over 4 years, less than 25%. Today, it takes over 40%. Now, one of the reasons is that tuition has been going up, but part of the problem is that median earnings in the US are flat and declining, right? It's why the conversation right now in this presidential election is about income inequality. And to me, this is the most worrisome trend if I were a higher education leader, and why I think personally that higher education leaders need to be engaged on these conversations around income, because it's not only in the national interest, it's really in their personal interest. Because here's a number that really worries me. This number comes from a demographic study that WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, did last year, right? There are 450 counties in the US that have more younger kids than older kids. 450 counties. More people 4, 5, 6 years old than there are people in their 50s and 60s. All but 100 of those counties, so 350 of those 450 counties, have lower median incomes than the national average. Those are your future students, right? We know the future students are going to look very different than today's students, but they're also going to have an incredibly different ability to pay in the future. And again, I think that as we think about the future of higher education, we really have to be focused on these numbers, especially around cost. So when I was reporting the book, the College Unbound, and even when I was reporting this last book, I talked to a lot of parents and students, and we tend to have this vision of American higher education that I think is largely shaped by Hollywood, right? By our movies, by our popular culture, by our television shows. Monsters University. How many of you seen Monsters University? Great movie. But so I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old at home, so I've seen it a couple of times. And when it first came out, I saw this interview with the producers and the writers. And one of the things they had to figure out is they had to build a college campus for Monsters University. And so they wanted to take a tour of a couple of college campuses, and they picked 3 to figure out what today's American college campus looks like. They picked MIT, Berkeley, and Harvard. Because to them, now they happen to also be, some of them were graduates of those institutions, but to them, that is what American higher education is, right? Those 3 types of universities. Well, give them credit, they did pick one public. But that's to them is what American higher education is. And as I mentioned in the book, this really is a Hollywood version of American higher education, because 80% of American university students don't follow that traditional pathway. 20% of students go to a 4-year college right after high school, residential college, and graduate in 4 years. 20% of American students. So 80% of American students take some other sort of pathway. They go part-time, they don't graduate in 4 years, they don't go to a residential campus, they live at home, or they're working while they're going to campus. So 80% of American students. But yet again, we tend to think in this country, both politically and culturally, very different about American higher education. It's fascinating to me, even in Washington, when I'm talking to people on Capitol Hill about higher education, their whole view of the world is the view that they had as undergraduates or as graduate students. And the fact of the matter is that most of the staff members working on Capitol Hill had this experience, right? They had this experience that your students are having today, and it's very hard for them to imagine a different experience for students. But even the students who come through this traditional experience are witnessing different ways of them getting through it. So for example, 3 out of 4 students now transfer at least once before they earn a bachelor's degree, according to the National Student Clearinghouse. 4 out of 5 tell researchers that they're drifting through college. They're not quite sure why they're there, except that in this country after high school, your choices are pretty limited, right? You could graduate from high school and get a job, and not a very good one, with a high school diploma. You could live at home in your parents' basement, and most parents don't want that to happen. You could go to the military, and that's a small percentage of students who do that, or you could go to college, which is why every fall, about 70% of American students who had graduated the previous spring from high school go right on to college. And then some of them end up in this group. 400,000 students who drop out of college every year. 400,000 students drop out of college every year at different stages. And what worries me about this particular number is a couple of months ago when Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, was still in the Republican presidential race, as you may know, there was a lot of controversy around his college experience because he didn't graduate from college. He was short of a few credits. And so the Washington Post asked me to write something on this. And I was speaking with researchers at the National Student Clearinghouse, and they had just come out with a report on people with college credit but no degree, which is 30 plus million Americans have some college credit and no degree. And in fact, there are many more, in some cases of them, in some age groups, than there are people with degrees. And what worried me as I was looking at their statistics is that the largest share of those people with some college credit and no degree are people in their 20s, right? Now, some ways that may make sense, right? Because and these are people who have stopped out for more than just 1 or 2 semesters, they'll eventually, like people in their 30s and 40s, will go back and get that degree, we think, right? That is the past experience of that age group. But it's a large group of students who have some college credit and no degree. And even for those students who end up on the other side, and these numbers are improving, we have about almost 50% of students, according to the Federal Reserve, who are underemployed, meaning they're in jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. The unemployment rate now is much lower than this for recent classes, but of course the debt number is growing, so about $35,000 for the most recent class. So why is this? Why do we have so many issues of getting students through the pipeline and then even at the end of the pipeline? Why do we have such a disconnect between higher education and the job market? So this is really the focus of my next book, There Is Life After College. So I really spent a lot of time over the last couple of years talking to employers of all sizes and in all industries. And what I heard over and over again when I asked them, what are the skills you're missing most in today's students, is something that we see in surveys, whether it's AAC&U or other groups have taken over recent years, and to be honest with you, go back a couple of decades. And it's really what we would all probably consider the skills of liberal arts. The softer skills, as some people might call them. I call them the hard skills because I think they're hard to teach. And so we tend to, I think, we need to have a better name for them than the soft skills. And I really started to, as I started talking to these employers over the last couple of years, I started to wonder, why do we have this disconnect between an education system and an economy and even discounting the complaints of employers? Why is there this disconnect? And as you look through the history of the U.S., particularly post-World War II, it used to be that you could go to college and get a broad education and come out and get training in a particular field, either at graduate school or by a particular employer who knew that you would probably stay there for 30 years. And this was in a day and age when fewer people needed a bachelor's degree to succeed financially in this country. So you would get this broad education at the undergraduate level and get these skills, and then move into the more job-specific training afterwards. We now expect those two things to happen in tandem, which is why on many campuses we have so many debates and so much tension between the practical arts and the liberal arts, because we expect those two things to happen at the same time. But on top of that, over the last 10 or 15 years, our expectations for a bachelor's degree have, I think, outstripped the time we give to the bachelor's degree. And what do I mean by that? I basically think that the bachelor's degree is overworked today and really needs to be redesigned, right? So on one level, we have this push on one side for more practical experiences in the bachelor's degree, and on the other side for more liberal arts experiences. But on top of that, we have a push for more experiential learning, undergraduate research, and study abroad and internships. We have more students who are coming to college who are not college ready and need remedial education, which is inserted into this 4-year degree. And then we have students who need to work while they're in college, and there's pressure both at the federal level and at the state level to make sure these students get done in 4 years, right? So the fact of the matter is that over the last couple of decades, our expectations, whether we're professors, employers, parents, or students, our expectations of the 4-year bachelor's degree, I think, have become too much. And I think it has now come time that if we're ever going to develop these skills needed, instead of less time, we actually need more time to do this at the undergraduate level. And I'm going to lay out what I think is a potential vision for higher education becoming less of a box you enter at the beginning of college and you exit 4 years later, and much more of a platform for lifelong learning. And what might this look like? So this is the traditional model of the transition from college to the workforce, right? This is the model my father, who's now 80, followed. He graduated from college, he got a job, worked there for 33 years, retired. Simple, linear. It's a model that whether people went to higher ed or not, followed, right? Even if they graduated from high school 30, 40 years ago, or even longer, you would follow this model. This is a new model that has been drawn by Tony Carnevale, who's an economist at Georgetown University. And he recently was looking back through decades of Bureau of Labor statistics, and he started to notice some trends in how people approached work post-education. And what he found was that people in their 20s started to move through jobs and change jobs more often in recent years than they did in previous generations, right? So they did a lot of job hopping in their 20s. He also noted that people were going back to get credentials, as I mentioned earlier, at different points in their lives. And not just their first credential, but their second and third credential, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s. And so he developed what he called this new model, where you move from education into a period of your 20s, which he called a learning and earning period, before you move into a career, at which time, by the way, education continues. You eventually transition to retirement until you're in your full retirement. One thing that he noticed when he was looking through these statistics, not only from the Bureau of Labor statistics, but also from the Census Bureau, is that the age at which people reach the median wage in this country started to increase. So we think of, he calls it financial independence, when they reach the median wage in this country. And it moved from the age of 26 in 1986 to 30 now in 2015, right? So it moved in 4 years is actually pretty significant, right? And so what he started to see was that this period of your 20s the period of your 20s today is very different than the period of 20s for previous generations. And this is something I really found when I was researching this new book and spending a lot of time with people in their 20s, right? And we did a survey for the new book, which I'll tease you a little bit with. I haven't been talking a lot about this because the New York Times is going to run a piece about this in a couple of weeks. But if we are off the record here for this moment, I'll tell you a little bit about the survey. And we surveyed a bunch of people in their mid-20s for the book. And we wanted to find out what were the experiences that they had in college that led them to launch after college. And how did they launch after college? And one of the things we found was that students launch from college in one of three ways. They're either sprinters, meaning they launch pretty quickly out of the gate, and it's largely because of the experiences they had in college that lead them to sprint out of the gate. But the concern I have are for those people in the middle, which we call the wanderers, or the stragglers, that take most of their 20s to kind of figure out their career path. Now, many of them do, and they go on to great success. But there is a lot of economic research out there that your 20s are essentially the dress rehearsal for the rest of your life, right? In fact, especially for men, a lot of their income gains really happen in their 20s and set you up for the rest of your career. And so as we think about the future of higher education, this idea that we say goodbye to students at the age of 22 and say good luck, move on, and maybe you'll come back to graduate school, I think has to be really rethought. And that this period of learning and earning is a critical period for students now in their 20s. And I think there is a role for higher education institutions such as yours, because as I'm about to tell you, there are others who are taking on that role. Right? Dan Porterfield, who's the president at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania and used to be a vice president at Georgetown, talks about this 10-year zone of impact for colleges and universities today. The year before college, the 4 years of college, and the 5 years after graduation. And I think that part, those 5 years after graduation, are critical for us to redefine, and I think could help us ease some of that tension around the 4 years of the bachelor's degree. So I started thinking about writing College Unbound when my wife and I were about to have our second child. So we have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old at home. And this graphic ran in Time magazine a couple of weeks before my wife was due. And when I looked at it, I kind of freaked out, to be honest with you. So this showed what higher education, the cost of tuition, if trends continued, would be in the year 2025 when our oldest daughter would go to college, right? If she went to the most expensive private college, $237,000 for 4 years, $160,000 at an average private college, and $100,000 tuition alone, not room and board, at the average public college. So we opened up a 529 for her and crossed our fingers. But beyond that, I really started to think about how different their lives would be by the time they got to college in 2025. You know, here we are. We were saving for something that we thought would exist the way it does today. But the fact of the matter is that a third of kids born today might live to see their 100th birthday. But yet we think of college in the ways that all those parents and students thought of college, and the way Hollywood does, as this one place you go to, usually a physical place, one time in your life at the age of 18, even though we are going to be living and working longer. At the same time, they're going to be my kids are going to be switching jobs much more often than students of previous generations. But what's the second question we ask of students when we find out they're going to college? First question is, where are you going? Second question is, what are you going to major in, right? What are you going to major in, right? So and for some students, they think that's tantamount to picking a career at the age of 18. And what's fascinated me about in researching this new book is that, you know, students for the most part pick careers based on what's familiar to them. And what's worrisome to me is that as careers get more segregated by city and region, that some students never come in contact with with some careers at all by the time they get to college. And then they pick this major, and then 4 years later they start applying for jobs, and these job titles make no sense to them, right? Because we've never given them any exposure before, especially before college, but even during college, to some of these jobs. And so again, I think we need to rethink the definition of the major and how we rethink that, right? So Stanford University is playing with this idea of a mission instead of a major, right? Some people say, well, what are the problems you want to solve? And let's rethink majors around larger interdisciplinary fields. So it's all of these trends. It's these financial trends, these demographic trends, these trends in teaching and learning that really form the basis of College Unbound, where the student is at the center of this new system of higher education in the future. And this is the critical point, where it is this platform for lifelong learning, right? Lifelong learning has been part of the rhetoric of higher education for a long time. I think the reality is finally here, and we as institutions need to think about how we can serve students for a much longer period of time than 4 years. And how might this look? How might these pathways through higher education look in the future? I don't think there's one answer. And I also don't think we should just let students figure it out on their own, right? There's a big movement around DIY education, right? Do-it-yourself education. We'll give you all these open resources and you figure it out. Well, you know, most students can't even figure out the system we give them today. And now we are going to expect them to do that in the future. I think the institutions that are going to survive and thrive in the future are those institutions that set out various pathways, that mix and match ways of getting the degree and ways of delivering higher education in the future, so that we could have a mix between, for example, competency-based and adaptive education and traditional classroom education, online and hybrid education, where we have low residency options so that students don't have to live on campus for 15 weeks but have more practical experiences and more co-ops and work experience in the working world. It's interesting to me, as when I was researching this new book, I spent some time with the head of learning at Xerox, and he told me that a couple of years ago they did a survey of their new hires, people in their 20s, and they asked them, what kind of professional development do you want? And the number one requested piece of professional development they wanted was time management. They wanted more help in time management. And so he went back and he interviewed a lot of those new employees, and they had a very hard time figuring out how to manage the priorities of the workplace, which are a mashup of activities, because for most of their lives, they followed a syllabus or they followed a course catalog, or they followed a schedule, and they had a very hard time doing that. And so again, as we think about these pathways, how can we better prepare students to navigate the ambiguity of life that comes after college, in college, and even before college? I don't think this is all, by the way, on the backs of institutions, but also happens at the K through 12 level as well. And so in many ways, when I was researching College Unbound, students are already following these pathways. We tend to call them non-traditional students, but they're already following these pathways. Part of it is students who swirl, right? Those 1/3 of students who transfer at least once before they enter a bachelor's degree. And this idea has been around for decades now. And we used to think about students who swirl. They either couldn't get it together financially or academically, which is why they transferred between institutions. But according to Sallie Mae's How Americans Pay for College survey that they do every year, 23% now of community college students come from families making over $100,000 a year. Back in 2008, this was under 10%, right? So these are students who tend to come from families we think, have more financial wherewithal and are a little bit more savvy about higher education, and probably, and still do in many cases, send their sons and daughters to institutions like this. But increasingly, and I'm even seeing this, outside the suburbs of Washington, D.C., as I have conversations with parents who went to traditional four-year institutions themselves and are starting to say, maybe my son or daughter is better off starting at a community college and figuring out what they want to do, and getting their academics kind of in play before they move on to a four-year institution. And so what are the pathways that we're going to develop for this? Now, in many states, we've developed very good articulation agreements, and Jose James, who I profile in College Unbound, was part of that pathway system in Florida, where he was able to complete a four-year degree without ever leaving Valencia College, not because Valencia College offered a bachelor's degree, but because they had this direct connect pathway to the University of Central Florida. So he was guaranteed admission to the University of Central Florida as long as he completed his associate's degree at Valencia College, and he was also able to take his courses at Valencia College by the University of Central Florida, which had an outpost at Valencia College. And then there was Jennifer Black, who I just also happened to meet at the University of Central Florida in the book. And she was able to complete her four-year degree in 4 years, even though she had 2 minors. She worked part-time. She had multiple internships because she took a quarter of her classes in either online or hybrid format as a residential student at the University of Central Florida, where 2/3 of their students in any given semester take a online or hybrid course as residential students. And what interests me as I travel to some colleges, and many colleges are obviously experimenting more with online education and with hybrid courses, it's interesting to me that I meet somebody who's in charge of residential education, somebody who's in charge of online education, somebody who's in charge of hybrid education, right? We tend to think of these things in silos, where students like Jennifer are able to move much more seamlessly between them than we many times give them credit for. And then there is this idea of competency-based education, and Cheryl Hsu, who I profile in the book, who went to Western Governors University, where her shortest class was 2 weeks, her longest class was 14 weeks. She was able to complete her degree in 2.5 years and spend about $18,000, right? Which is why we now have hundreds of colleges, by various measures, it's somewhere between 200 and 400, offering some sort of competency-based program, meaning we base knowledge on what you know rather than how much time you spend in a seat. Now, I'm somewhat skeptical of, I think competency-based education has a huge potential to change the cost curve in higher education. I'm a little skeptical about how it can work, particularly among the traditional 18 to 22-year-olds. But I think that we could take some of the models of competency-based education, which I'll talk about in a minute, and apply them to traditional higher education, meaning the 18 to 22-year-olds. I'm not quite sure that we could ever move 18 to 22-year-olds to a fully competency-based model. At the same time, there have been a number of changes, and this is much more recent, and actually I don't talk a lot about it in the book, about the rise of a shadow learning economy throughout the U.S. So there's all these new providers that have mostly cropped up in the last 5 years that are offering education in shorter bites, right? So we have Coursera and edX, which are the big MOOC providers, lynda.com and the Khan Academy, along with all these coding boot camps. So I want to focus on one in particular, which is General Assembly. How many of you have heard of General Assembly? Okay, so General Assembly started 4 years ago by a number of entrepreneurs, and they have served 200,000 students in that time, in the last 4 years. Now, they offer courses anywhere from a couple of hours in everything from design thinking to project management to 11 weeks where they offer coding classes. They're part of this growing crop of coding academies that have cropped up in the last couple of years. Now, what's interesting to me, I took one of their courses in Washington a couple of years ago, and the average age of their student is 25, and 95% of them have a bachelor's degree, right? So these are those students that I was talking about earlier who are in that learning and earning period, who in some cases, probably in a different generation, would have gone back to graduate school or a professional school to get a certificate, and now are looking for other ways of gaining that knowledge to succeed in the workforce because they know they're going to need to continue to go back to get education. And so the question for, I think, traditional institutions is how do we serve that market? Because what's interesting to me, if you talk to these students at General Assembly, they don't really want to go to this place called General Assembly. They would actually rather go back to their alma mater or to other institutions, but they're not offering their education in that way. And this is what's interesting to me about the MOOC providers and the debate about MOOCs over the last couple of years, massively online open courses. I did this. I wrote a short ebook about MOOCs a couple of years ago, and I followed one course, Coursera, a course that Coursera was offering through the University of Virginia. And what interested me about the students taking that course is that we tend to think MOOCs are a failure because only 10% of students actually complete them. So hundreds of thousands of students sign up for them. Only a small, a percentage of those students actually show up on the first day, but the big number that people keep pointing to is only 10% of them complete it. And what interested me about these students, and research from Michigan and Penn backed this up, is that most of these students didn't want to finish the course. In fact, they didn't want to take the course, right? They were interested in a small bit of information from that course. They wanted to watch one lecture or do a couple of readings, right? They were going to go in, they were going to dive in, get what they needed, and come out. And in this case, it was an entrepreneurial course, so they were all working for themselves, essentially, and they didn't necessarily need the credential at the end of the day. And it's how many of us are learning these days in our own way, right? If you want to repair something in your house or you want to know how to make a new recipe, what do? You jump online, you look up a YouTube video, and you have to usually get rid of some of the trash in some of those videos, but you usually find a good one, and you learn what you need to do, and you move on, right? So it's these shorter chunks of learning that, again, what I think the places like General Assembly have figured out, because they know that students are going to need to cycle back in and out over time. And this is what Stanford University has been thinking about. So this is a design that Stanford University's D School came up with a couple of years ago when their president asked them to rethink undergraduate education in the year 2025. And it was a design exercise that included faculty, included undergraduate students, graduate students, and others at the university. And the idea was to provoke a conversation. So they came out with these provocations. They're not actually designing this, but this was what they called an open loop university, a sketch of what they called the open loop university. And the idea behind this was that you would get accepted to Stanford University at the age of 18. Instead of getting access to 4 years of education, you would get access to 6 years of education that you could use any time throughout your lifetime, right? So you could loop in, take the traditional 4 years and still have 2 years left, right? Or you could loop out after a couple of years and come back at any point throughout your career in your 30s and 40s, right? It was a way to appeal to that idea of lifelong learning and a way to appeal to those 20-somethings particularly who needed extra education in their 20s. Now, Stanford may not do this, but a couple of other universities are thinking about this idea of university for life. I think the biggest challenge right now is how do we price it? And if students never end, how do we say they graduated? So there's a lot of hurdles to this, but this is an idea that I think whose time has come. And the question is, what are the universities that are going to be the first to offer this in the future? So when I was researching the book, I came across this quote from this vice president of Amazon, and I know this is not exactly a company all the time that we want to replicate, but it was interesting to me how if we think about those companies that I mentioned earlier, the Tower Records, the Blockbusters of the world, and all those industries, what happened, right? The distance between the producer and the consumer started to shrink, right? And so if we turn this on its head and think about this in terms of higher education, what happens? What happens, and this quote is meant as a provocation. I don't think that residential campuses are going away, but what are the challenges and opportunities if the distance between a teacher and a student starts to shrink, right? What are the opportunities on a residential campus like this as we think about this future? And in many ways, this is already happening, right? We know this is happening through the MOOCs, but it's even happening at traditional universities. So this is MR University. I've taken a couple of classes here. This was started by an economics professor at George Mason University, a large public university in Northern Virginia, Tyler Cowen, who writes a popular blog called Marginal Revolution. I had been following him for years, and he noted he had all these followers online, and his university wasn't jumping on the MOOC bandwagon. And so one day he went home and he started to record his lectures on a $5 iPad app, and that night he put them up online. And then eventually designed this very nice website. But what he noted was that he had reached more students in the course of the first 6 months of this university than he did the entire time teaching at George Mason University. Now, he doesn't give credit out, he doesn't charge anything. But to me, this was great, right? I wanted to do extra, I wanted to take economics courses again. I didn't want to really sign up at a local college to do that, and I was able to do that by one of the preeminent professors in the country on some of these subjects, right? This, to me, is a future free agent market in higher education as we think about the future of the teacher and the learner in the future of higher education. So I want to end talking a little bit about what is a commodity as we think about the value of higher education and what is truly innovative. This quote comes from A.G. Lafley, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, who was worried in the 1990s when they bought Gillette. And one of the reasons they ended up buying Gillette was because he was starting to note that everything that they produced was being copied around the world at a much lower, and being sold at a much lower price point. And he started to think that, are we in the commodity business or are we in the innovation business? And as I ask this question of college leaders or faculty members or trustees or senior leaders at colleges, I usually get different answers, right? If we went around this room and I asked you what is truly innovative about what you're doing and what is truly a commodity about what you're doing, you're going to have many different answers, right? Because it's a college campus, knowledge is always increasing. We keep adding rather than deleting, and I think the question now as we move towards the future and especially focus on this cost is what is a commodity and what is truly innovative about what you're doing? And this, to me, comes down to this value question in higher ed. And this question has been asked of in a number of surveys from Pew and Time, and the Carnegie Foundation of New York has asked this question on a number of surveys over the last couple of years. And it was asking Americans who either had kids in college or were going to colleges themselves to rank the value of higher education for the money spent. 40% ranked it of the public ranked it as good or excellent. 60% fair or poor. College presidents think it's great. 75% said good or excellent. Only 25% said fair or poor. The Chronicle put this on a survey of 3,000 faculty members a couple of years ago, and I expected it to be close to 75%. They were actually lower than the public, faculty members, talking about education at their own institutions. So this number was quite surprising. Now, this is only one. The other surveys have multiple surveys by multiple places over a couple of years. This was only one survey point, so we have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But 31%, and we started doing follow-up interviews, and what we started to find out was that faculty members that we interviewed were worried about the lack of rigor in their own classrooms, this consumer mentality that has kind of taken over higher education. And they were really worried about the value that students were getting for that money spent. And to me, this value equation is going to replace the inputs of the last 20 or 30 years that have been really pushed forward by, I think, the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Because I think we're now entering an era, no longer can institutions afford to play that prestige race, but I also think we're entering an era in higher education where we're going to focus much more on the outputs. And right now, And in somewhat unfortunate, the outputs are very focused on economics. You know, are you getting a job, and where are you working? But we're starting to see by a number of outlets, and this is LinkedIn and their LinkedIn University pages, which they started putting together a couple of years ago, because LinkedIn has 300 million members around the world. They know before you know when your graduates have switched jobs, right? So a couple of years ago, they started aggregating all this data together, and they started reverse engineering careers, and they wanted to find out what are the experiences that people had before they got this job, this particular job, and they're now going down to the university level, and in some cases, they're working with some universities to go down to the actual course level. You know, what are the courses at an individual university level that truly make a difference in somebody's career? And they're hoping that over a couple of years of data, of collecting this data through universities, they'll know this, right? But we're starting to see, and it's not only LinkedIn, it's The Economist, it's the President's Scorecard, it's others that are starting to look at these output measures of higher education. And in some ways, I think this is hugely democratizing to institutions, because the U.S. News and World Report rankings largely were unchanged over the last 10 or 15 years based on these input measures, right? Even though some institutions spent a lot of money to try to get those numbers to move. This to me, and unfortunately, again, it's focused mostly on economic measures now, but as we start to think about the work that Gallup is doing, and even the work of NESE and other surveys around student engagement, we start to learn the other value measures, the other value outputs of higher education. And to me, I visited with LinkedIn a couple of months ago, they're already starting to rank. I think the rankings, we're not getting rid of rankings, unfortunately, but I think that the rankings over the next 10 or 15 years, if the last 10 or 15 years have all been about the input measures that led to the prestige race, I think the next 10 or 15 years will be about these output measures that truly change the conversation in higher education to measure the value of an individual institution. So almost every decade since the beginning of time, somebody has predicted that higher education institutions were going to go out of business. When I was researching the book, you know, the Chronicle and a number of other publications in the 1970s and in the 1990s predicted institutions would close. And in fact, this article from Newsweek back in 1976 predicted hundreds of institutions would close in the following decade. Now, Newsweek closed, but we actually now have more institutions today than we did in 1976, right? So predicting the future is a very dangerous business. So I get a little nervous about talking about what I think might happen. But one of the things I noted as I was looking and researching and reporting this book over the last couple of years is that we tend to overestimate the speed of change in higher education and all change in a lot of areas of our lives, but we tend to underestimate the depth of change, right? So I was telling you earlier about sitting in rooms very similar to this in the late 1990s, listening to somebody talk about changes in my own industry, right, the journalism industry, and somebody saying someday somebody would read a newspaper on a desktop computer, right? Well, nobody ever predicted this, right? Nobody ever predicted we would be reading newspapers on devices as small as this one day. So we tend to overestimate the speed of change, underestimate the depth of change. But I'm very confident about the future of higher education, because one of the things is that I think the industry is in turmoil right now, but that the entire sector of higher education around the world is stronger than ever. There are more people around the world demanding education than ever before, right? So we may, as an industry, be in turmoil right now, but the demand for what you do is greater than ever before. And now we have to figure out how to match that. Thank you very much for your time today. Again, plenty of time for questions or answers or any pushback, but I appreciate your time today. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
A lot of aggregate information
Yep.
is often used to scare us into believing certain things. So you gave us some aggregates about people that don't complete.
Yep.
They have some. How do you tease that out among traditional college campuses, for-profit college campuses, those that started at a 2-year?
Right.
And how do they differ? Across
Good question. Good question. I'm assuming everybody heard that. Yeah, so these are aggregate numbers, right? So we know, for example, that student debt the debt levels, which I talk about student debt at the average at graduation. I don't try to use that $1 trillion number that everybody uses, or the growth in student debt over the last decade plus, which has largely been at for-profit universities. Much of the growth in student debt has been at for-profit universities. The dropout rates differ greatly by institutions, differ greatly by socioeconomic measures. If there's any leak in the pipeline, well, there's many leaks in the pipeline, but the biggest leaks in the pipeline are really around that swirling that I was talking about. That's what worries me a little bit about these transfers, is that we know that students who start at a community college may have the intention of transferring to a four-year college and eventually graduating from there, but they do that at a very low rate. Not only do they transfer at a low rate, but then even when they transfer, they complete at a low rate. So yes, we tend to talk about higher education as a system. It's definitely not a system. We tend to talk about higher education much like we talk about employers in the singular. And there are very different types of institutions, just like there are different types of employers. I will say, though, we do have a very big diversity of higher education, right? Institutions of all kinds and sizes. What worries me, though, is that though many of those institutions are still trying to compete with each other and be like each other. We still have most institutions that start in September, end in May, 120 credits to the bachelor's degree, and a lot of that obviously is in regulation, both at the government level and at the accreditor level. But you're right, we have higher education is not a system, and we tend to talk about it in a system. But that doesn't mean those people who are not part of those statistics don't need to change, I guess is my final point. Answer your question? Yes?
In your book, you highlight Arizona State as,
Yep.
Really an innovator and is doing a lot of good things to reposition itself. I obtained a master's from Arizona State
Right.
way back at the dawn of time. It was a good school. I think value was there, but it was hardly the Harvard of the
Right.
West or anything.
And it still isn't. and I teach there. Yeah.
But I'm just curious, what is it about Arizona State now that makes you highlight it at so many points in your book as a major innovator and kind of with a major for-profit player right in its backyard there? Speak a little bit about that side of the picture.
Yeah, I would put major now in quotes, given what's happened to the University of Phoenix. But I actually think that has had little. The for-profit player in the backyard has had little impact on Arizona State. I've gotten to know Michael Crow pretty well, the president of Arizona State, over the last couple of years, and I think he is motivated by other issues, and the big one is this massive need to educate a larger group of students at a time when we essentially stopped developing higher education, right? So, we talk about this growth in institutions over the last 20 plus years, but most of that growth was in the for-profit industry or smaller little private colleges, right? So like the nation's most elite colleges have not grown at all for the most part. Many publics have not grown at all. Yet we have this massive need, especially out west where he's located, to educate more students. And so he's been motivated largely by this pressure, and and he lives next door to California, and their response has been to to close out students, right? Even though they have had more demand, they basically said, well, these are all the spots we have, too bad. And his response was to grow. Now he gets a lot of criticism for that. People think they're too big, and they're enormous, right? But his response is, there's a need, right? And we have to serve that need, and we have to meet the students with where they are. So that's online. That's with partnerships with Starbucks. So he's motivated really by that, and he's motivated largely also that we have to reflect the population we serve, right? So they are, if you look at the numbers, they're very very close to meeting the socioeconomic and the race and ethnicity of the state. Now, their success rates are a little bit uneven, like they are at most institutions in serving those students, but they're trying. as are a couple of other universities. Georgia State, I think I also highlight in the book, and probably would highlight a little bit more now. So why them, right? So I think there's two things that and Georgia State, I think, is very similar in this way. So as a kind of a foil to, not a foil, but another counterpart to Arizona State, two things: leadership. People always ask me, like, what's the biggest difference between those institutions on the move or doing interesting things or trying new things and everybody else? And I know sounds like a cliche, but it really is. It's the leadership, and it's the leader, right? It's not just leadership. You can meet some really interesting people at the highest levels of the faculty and the administration, but if the president is not leading this effort, and I think Michael Crow does that, I think Mark Becker at Georgia State, and I think a dozen others that I can name off the top of my head, they're the ones leading that effort. So that's one, is that a leader who truly believes this is a mission, and this is how we're going to reach that mission, and I'm going to allow experimentation, I'm going to allow some failure. And then the second piece of this is experimentation, right? Arizona State does a lot of experiments, and more than half of them fail. But more, half of them succeed. Almost half of them succeed, and what they do is they scale those up very quickly. And that, to me, is the difference and why I highlighted them in the book, because as I said earlier, there's a lot of experimentation in higher ed, but it never moves beyond that stage, right? We tend to say, this program's working really well in this department or this school, and what they do at Arizona State and Georgia State and a couple of other places is they then blow that out and they say, okay, let's model this for other places in the institution, which is the idea behind, in one of your counterparts here in the state, Ohio State is part of this University Innovation Alliance that ASU and 10 other public universities put together last year, because that was 2 years ago, because that was the idea behind it. The idea was, if we have one innovation working, now that's to scale it up to the university level, right? So if we had one innovation working in a specific department, let's move it to an entire university. In this case, if we have something that's working at one university, why not copy it at other places and make that easier, and which is why they started the University Innovation Alliance. I don't think ASU is perfect. There's plenty, there's problems at every university. There's things that they claim are working that I don't think are working necessarily. But for the most part, I think the difference there is that they're willing to try things. And again, I think that's pretty common throughout higher ed, but that when things work, they move quickly to scale that across an entire institution. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, in the back. Sorry, I injured my shoulder skiing over the weekend and I can't raise my hand all the way. Yep. Right.
As I understand it, employers were much more willing to help people get skills, say 20, 30 years ago, than they are now.
Right.
Because of employees moving around so much, you might give somebody a skill and then they're gone.
So this is a very difficult question to answer, just like there's no one higher education system, there's no one employer, right? And we tend to say employers, right? So it differs by sector, it differs by size. It also differs, and I think this is really important when you're looking at surveys of employers, it differs by function within the employer, right? So a CEO, and I was telling this story at lunch, a CEO is going to differ greatly from a chief human resources officer, is going to differ greatly from the person who's doing the day-to-day hiring, the line manager, for example. So, I have this example in the new book from Procter & Gamble, right here in your home state of Ohio, where I saw A.G. Lafley at this seminar for liberal arts colleges a couple of years ago. He went to Hamilton College in upstate New York. He actually wanted to be a college professor in the humanities. And he was going on and on about how great liberal arts college graduates are. And so afterwards I went up to him and I said, oh, this is great. Could I come to Cincinnati? I want to see how you do hiring and so forth. So he did that. I went to Cincinnati. And I started to see the breakdown in what he was saying already by just spending some time with the human resources staff there. They were looking for a variety of skills, not just these liberal arts skills. And then I went with the recruiters, and I met this recruiter at a university, and she said, well, that's all fine and good, but you should have asked A.G. Laughlin when was the last time he hired a college graduate, like a new college graduate, right? It was years. I mean, to me, trying to follow what employers want is almost an impossible task because, again, it differs by sector, it differs by size, it differs by function within the university. Now, one thing I will say, and again, with that caveat that it's impossible to make a blanket statement, and now I'm about to make one, is that I actually did not hear, when I've spent the last couple of years talking to employers of all sizes and all kinds, I did not hear the same thing about the hard skills. Like, we want somebody trained to do X. It was much more about the soft skills that I heard over and over again that they were not getting, right? This ability to learn from failure, this ability to navigate ambiguity, right? So even if you look at, there's this study which I cite in the new book, and you can look it up online pretty easily, Burning Glass Technologies out of Boston. They're a data analytics company. And last year, they scraped 20 million job ads. And they looked for the key words in those job ads, the key skills that people are looking for. And their contention is that when somebody writes a job ad, they're writing for skills that they're not usually getting, right? They don't tell you all the skills that they usually see in most employees because they'll know they'll probably get those no matter what. So they put in the job ad and the job description skills that they actually want and they're usually not getting. And when they scraped those 20 million job ads, 3 out of 4 job ads, there were 25 key competencies. And almost every single one of them included 5 in particular. Now, I'm not going to remember all 5. Communication skills, customer service skills, the usual ones, many of the ones that I listed up there. And Microsoft Excel, by the way, made it like almost every single one. I always tell English majors, no matter what, make sure you know how to use Microsoft. So there was one hard skill. Okay, so there was one hard skill. The other 4 were what we call the soft skills. So my contention is that even though, and you may in a specific discipline hear from employers who say, we want people who know how to code, or we want people who know how to work this machine, or whatever it might be. But largely, I'm hearing from employers that there's these students who, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, they just don't know how to navigate the mashup that is a job today, right? That they have this inability to, as the head of human resources at Enterprise Rent-A-Car told me, they've been syllabused through their lives. Not your fault, by the way. I think this goes all the way back to parenting. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old at home. I see exactly what we're doing wrong already. And K through 12, right? So learning has been directed for them the whole time. They follow a course schedule. They follow a course catalog. They follow a syllabus. And so then they get in a job, and we all know jobs don't work like that. I don't know what's changed. We were talking about this at lunch. That's not, I had a syllabus when I was in college, right? So it's not that different. So I'm not quite sure what the disconnect is, but I don't believe it's just the hard skills that they want is the bottom line. I heard many more times about the soft skills that they want. And so the question is, are colleges providing those soft skills? In many cases, I think they are. I think they're doing a really good job at providing those soft skills. And it doesn't just come in the classroom. It comes in this residential experience. I think the residential experience is critical for that. It's why, by the way, when Minerva, this new online elite college started, they didn't get rid of the residential experience because they thought that the residential experience really matters to the development of the soft skills. The question is, for some reason, employers don't think they're getting those soft skills, or they can't see the clear signal that somebody has those soft skills. I think that's more of the issue. So where I see a benefit in the future of this idea of badges and alternative credentials and things like this is around these softer skills, right? Can we somehow measure whether a student has some of these skills and then give a signal to employers that that student is ready for those softer skills? I'll be very fast with the answer. You sure? I promise. Go ahead. We have time.
You said early on in this talk that you didn't like to call soft skills because they're hard to
Yep.
teach, right? So it's the tension in the trend of education as a whole is that it seems to me that those soft skills are not just hard to teach, they're also actually quite
But then other things that we do still give a high touch to can be scaled. So, for example, the 300-person lecture class that meets 3 days a week in a physical place, right? We could scale that in a different way and offer that through technology, and perhaps, I mean, I know it's not this easy, but we could save money there in order to invest money in high touch things, such as these soft skills. They also, as we talked about at lunch, they also don't need to necessarily be offered in the classroom or on a campus, right? So they can be delivered through co-ops and apprenticeships and undergraduate research and other things, which again are all high touch and still require administrative support. Understood, right? But I guess there's other. I'm not saying we're actually going to cut costs this way, but I think we could. You know, I didn't talk a lot about this effort at Georgetown, which is trying to figure out how to integrate the soft skills with the hard skills and do it in a 4-year period. And the idea there has never been about reducing cost. They always knew that at the end of the day, their degree is going to cost what it is today. What they wanted to do was increase value, because a place like Georgetown competes with very elite institutions that have a lot more money than they do. And what they're worried about is that they're not going to be able to keep up with the Joneses. And they need to prove to students and parents that if you come to Georgetown, you're going to get a lot more value for that money. You're going to still have to spend $60,000 a year. We're not going to charge you $40,000, but you're going to get a lot more value out of it. So that, to me, is the question that we should be asking around these soft skills. Is there other areas that we could scale in order to invest in this money? I mean, right now, unfortunately, all the discussion about online education scaling is all about reducing costs, right? It's all about getting the cost of a degree to be, as Rick Perry said, $10,000 a year, right? I didn't. If I was Donald Trump, I would repeat what you just did. But anyway, I think what we need to do is recenter the conversation around. We do need to work on cost, but that's because we need to increase investments in other areas. That, to me, is the conversation that has to be, because I think then people will, those value numbers I showed you about people value for the money they spend, I think those numbers will start to edge up. I really do believe it. So, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. I'm around for a little bit. Thank you.